You made it, you made it. Great. Fantastic. Do you need a moment?
No
ready?
moment.
You're right. That's how you roll. Brilliant. Tell me when we're ready. We are great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ODI Global. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Amy has been running across town. We're blaming.
I'm
biking.
across town.
Fantastic. Well, we do have a state visit from President Macron, so all the
Roads.
shut down the roads. Yes, you should know. You've been riding with President Biden, so you know. Anyway, I'm really, really delighted to have you here, Amy, because I mean, really critical conversation. That's why we have so many people in the room here, a lot online. Amy, I'm sure you all know, is the first woman to lead the International Organization on Migration in its 70 plus years history. Finally, at last, they got there. And of course, you're steering, the organization at a really critical time. It's a really difficult moment when displacement is not, just increasing, but is actually becoming more complex, more protracted. And of course, the context around us is shifting very fast. I mean, Amy needs no introduction, but before IOM, she worked on, migration issues for a long time. As I sort of indirectly mentioned, she worked closely with President Biden as a senior advisor on migration. You had many roles at the White House with President Obama, working as a deputy Homeland Security advisor, a special assistant to the president, and you've worked on many migration-related issues from climate to pandemics like Zika, Ebola, anti-trafficking, worked at the Department of Justice and the Senate, always working on migration security legislation. So we have a great opportunity to reflect, with you on, this issue that we're all very seized with. And I just want to, before I open the conversation, to take a moment to frame the conversation. Like today we've got more than 117 million people displaced. I mean, it's a staggering figure if you think about it, 170 million people. It's a record high. But displacement is no longer just a humanitarian issue, and that is what I'm hoping we can discuss. Today it intersects with climate, with the growing urbanization, with shifts in the labor market, with the climate breakdown. And yet we see the responses that continue to be really fragmented, siloed, just not connected, and above all, disconnected from people's real needs. And we see that through our research at ODI. We've published a few reports, like Trusting the Displaced report, that actually really looked at how displaced people are very often disconnected from planning completely. We've done a lot of work on diaspora engagement, which has really, really revealed how these communities are not just remittance funders, they are first responders, they're innovators, they're strategic actors in development, and yet not really connected. And we have a migration displacement hub that is really tried to shift the conversation on developing a more just, pragmatic, evidence-based, policy on migration and displacement. And that's why, we felt that it's really important to have this conversation today, because it's time to reframe it, not just around crisis, but really around systems, rights, contributions. And that's what you're trying to do at IOM as well. So let's dive in. Let's discuss how it is that we can shift this conversation. I hope you are all okay for us to extend the conversation beyond 5 o'clock a little bit so that we can get the full hour with Amy. But I have a few questions to ask you, and then I'll give an opportunity to everyone here and the online audience to ask questions. So get ready. But let me start. As I mentioned, we see this challenge between the link with displacement and all these intersecting crises, and yet these policies responses are very reactive, very short term. How do you think we can reframe this global displacement, not just as a humanitarian emergency, as people continue to think about, but as a development system rights-based challenge?
Okay, so first of all, I have to say I'm so pleased to be here, Sara. Thank you for having this conversation. I'm so sorry to make you all wait. I do blame President Macron. I do want you to know we got on Lime bikes and we biked here across town from Trafalgar. And that, if you know me and my biking skills, is a serious commitment to you, Sarah, and to ODI. So
And we're very grateful. And the UN USG on a Lime bike, that's a first.
I thought it was so important to be here and to have this conversation with you. So I'm gonna hopefully will provoke a bit of rethinking of this, and I'll be a little bit deliberately provocative, because I'll start with the premise that people fund crisis because it's sexy. I mean, come on, like everybody wants to. You see poor children who are starving, who have lost their homes, who are crying. You see grandmothers carrying their suitcases, and that tugs at the heartstrings. And unfortunately, that's where our movie ends, right? They get the nice gift of a, care package with their blanket, and maybe a family is offering them some temporary shelter to them. Curtains close, audience claps, we all walk away. But in real life, what happens is that people live in a state of displacement for year upon year upon year upon year. And they're effectively forgotten. And the best examples that we've seen of that are places like Kakuma or Dadaab, where you have entire generations. I have a woman who is working for me who's in her early 30s, who moved to Dadaab as an infant, and she spent her entire life in the camp. And we hired her. And at one point I said, so how long were you there? And she's like, well, how old is Dadaab? I mean, she grew up in this place, and her sisters now have children. Their generations being born in displacement. And this is where I'm a bit provocative. I think it's been a little too convenient for the international donor community to give a bit of money in a humanitarian disaster and then say, look, we've done our job, let's pat ourselves on the back, job done, and then kind of walk away, right? And that is the problem that we are trying to solve. How do we move from funding the sexy to funding the sustainable?
Yeah, and in reality, it continues to perpetuate this very paternalistic attitude that we have towards people in crisis.
Yeah.
So a little bit of handout, our largesse, and that, sort of should do for you. But I think the critical issue is that we completely exclude people from planning around a response that could be more targeted, more, sort of more meaningful. As you say, these are long-term crises, but yet they're not included in, social protection schemes. We don't even think about access to decent work.
Yeah.
We don't even ask them most of
Yeah.
the time what their aspirations are or what they need. We just assume. But where do you see opportunities to try and rebuild trust between displaced communities and those the system that is meant to support them, from governments to, quite frankly, international institutions and also private actors?
And you just start by asking them what it is they need. And this should not be groundbreaking, but sadly, it kind of is. So we at IOM, we did a report called the Progress Report, and we used all of we have something called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, and we have hundreds of people all around the world who talk to people who are on the move. And then just ask them, what do you need? Sort of what do you need to go from living in the state of vulnerability to something that is more stable? A couple of things we learned that I think they should be common sense, but not always. Number one is shelter, right? Once people have food, what they care about is shelter. And if they have stable shelter, and I mean a kind of shelter where you can lock your door at night and you're not worried that your children are going to be raped. Once you have stable shelter, then you can start to think about the future, right? So an investment in shelter is actually an investment in enabling someone to start thinking about their next step. The other thing we learned that was really interesting is that many people, after they've been displaced, don't actually want to go home, right? So especially the longer they're displaced, they start to set down roots. They envision a life for themselves wherever they've ended up, and enabling them to find a job, to allow them to work wherever they are, to allow them to have access to education for their children is a critical enabler. And that doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen often for a host of political reasons, not capacity reasons. But so that suggests if you are an actor on the outside trying to enable a better outcome for someone, you actually, your better intervention, let's get folks stable shelter, but then to engage politically with the community where that person lives and get them access to work, get them access to schools. And right now that's not happening.
Yeah, and that totally tallies with my experience of working with displaced people. I always say that after the first 6 months of an acute crisis, where people are really focused on the, more
Staying alive.
exactly survival, then immediately they start thinking about education for their kids.
Yeah.
The next school year that they don't want them to miss, and then access to work, whether it's jobs or livelihoods, and this is exactly what the system doesn't support, because it's a political decision, exactly as you say.
I had this experience. I was in Goma in the DRC, and I often sit down with groups of women to talk to them about what their particular experience is. I was sitting down with a group of women, and in the DRC, as many as, and it could actually be higher, but 60% of the women in who have been displaced have also been subjected to some form of sexual assault, sexual abuse. The GBV rate is enormous, 60%, right? And so I'm sitting down with this group of women, talking to them about their particular challenges and opportunities. And one young woman said to me, I'm just so frustrated. I was displaced at a moment when I was in school. I really want to continue my education. All I want are books to continue to study, and I keep being given birth control so I don't get pregnant when I get raped. I mean, what the heck is wrong with our response, right? Like we are suffering, and I understand we don't want that. We should not want her to be raped. So let's start there. But we don't want her to get pregnant. We don't want her to end up in a situation of greater vulnerability. But why not actually figure out how we can get her some access to books and make that part of our intervention very early on, and not assume that everybody who's been displaced doesn't care about their future or their education or their work or their dreams.
100%. And actually, where we see a different attitude is from the diaspora communities.
Yeah.
They are the ones who are often supporting displaced communities with what they want and need. But they're not just, a financial lifeline. They're very often the first responders.
Yeah.
They are the innovators, the connectors. How is IOM working with diaspora actors beyond, just a focus on financial remittances, but really as more strategic partners in addressing displaced communities?
So we have not fully cracked the code on engaging the diaspora community. So let me start there. But we recognize that it's a very powerful enabler of a response. And more importantly, going from crisis to something more sustainable. And bringing the diaspora into those solutions. First of all, we haven't even cracked the code on how do we bring diaspora into a more coordinated response and engage diaspora as if you would engage another partner, any other partner. And often we'll see the diaspora is 10 steps ahead of the aid community in terms of providing whatever capacity or support is needed for those who've been impacted. So it's how do we engage the diaspora even before crisis starts? So we know, the diaspora it's not a monolith, right? It's not like one person who's like leading the diaspora. So it's figuring out who are the communities of interest. How do we engage them early on? How do we build those relationships early on? How do we build the financial channels so that money goes back without paying crazy remittance fees? Super excited about you, Revolut, for doing some work there. How do we then figure out in terms of expertise, in terms of learning, in terms of humanitarian pathways, if people cannot live safely in displacement, in terms of technology, in terms of awareness building, in terms of political engagement? There's a whole range of interventions that are needed that the diaspora is particularly well situated to engage, where we can engage them and where we don't now.
Yeah, and we've seen some very powerful examples recently. We've had conversations with humanitarian, like diaspora actors. They are supporting humanitarian response in Sudan through the emergency response rooms, and really they've been the lifeline of the years. These community-based initiatives are really catering for some of the most critical needs there, where international organizations cannot get.
Yep.
But we find it very difficult to channel funding to them because of all the challenges that the system lays for us. Do you have any examples to share of destination countries that have supported diaspora-led initiatives. I mean, they have responsibilities, right, towards displaced and migrants. And do they engage with diaspora? Is there anything that others can learn from?
Yes, there are some great examples. I am a big fan of Somalia. I know that may not be obvious to everyone, but in Somalia, you actually have some very powerful diaspora who left the country during the conflict and went to India, went to Canada, went to parts of Europe, went to parts of the US, many of whom have become quite successful, some of whom have come back into Somalia to help be part of the rebuilding of the country. And we've seen some really great examples, including in the UK, including in Finland, where they've engaged the Somali diaspora to be part of the funding and learning transfer between the diaspora here and communities back in Somalia, including around medicine, healthcare, doctors, et cetera. So that's a place where we see a lot of promise. And of course, Somalia is facing a tremendous number of challenges, also, ongoing conflict, ongoing drought, and other climate impact. But it is a place where the diaspora has been a force for change. And we see that often in post-conflict societies. People who flee during a conflict are often the ones who can go back and rebuild. And that will be the question about Syria, even. When we get to a place where Syria can be more stable, more safe, the Syrian population who fled were often extremely educated, right? And didn't always find work opportunities that fit their experience level outside. They will be critical to the rebuild of Syria and a strong and stable Syria. Likewise, Ukraine. So, making sure we maintain these connections, particularly in post-conflict societies, is actually a way to transition from humanitarian to something that is really promising and exciting.
Totally. Uh, Both of us have been very engaged in conversations about how to engage the private sector more in the response. There's things that we're both passionate about, and we've tried to do with World Economic Forum and others. You just mentioned Revolut, you're clearly doing something with them. I'm interested to hear more about it. But beyond specific examples, what do you think are the key elements that make a public-private partnerships really effective in this area? And what are the pitfalls?
So, okay, number one, you got to see beyond the money, right? So I know a lot of NGOs, INGOs, UN agencies see private sector and they think, oh, they'll give us lots of money. Right, right. That is the wrong way to approach the issue from our point of view. And I think the wonderful thing about IOM is that what we do actually brings value to the private sector. The private sector benefits when migration is well managed. The private sector benefits when countries are stable. The private sector benefits when there is an engaged, educated, skilled workforce to come and work in the private sector, right? So we see tremendous value in engaging the private sector as a partner in the solutions we offer for people who may be currently in a situation of distress or displacement. The other thing is that the private sector is frankly just a lot better than the humanitarian response sector at getting supplies quickly out to communities in need, at setting up communications infrastructure, at ensuring the supply chain is still intact in moments of natural disaster. So there's so much, and we are partnering with Microsoft, who's been a really fantastic partner for us. And it's not that Microsoft is giving us lots of money. They're investing in the AI skills of our staff, which enables our staff then to use what we know faster, more effectively, learn the lessons, apply the lessons. They're engaging and helping us to upskill the populations we serve. And then they're enabling us to use our data and the data of other partners more effectively to forecast communities that are going to be impacted by climate so that we can get ahead of the crisis. So Microsoft is really good at that. IOM is really good at delivering. We're really good at meeting populations where they are. We wouldn't otherwise know what to do with AI. So having those partners who help us move forward faster is critical.
And what do you think are some of the potential pitfalls of these partnerships if you really want to make sure they are meaningful and sustainable?
So number one is it goes back to it's always sexy to fund a crisis, right? And so there's a real danger that the partnership only lasts for the moment that the issue is in the news. And figuring out how to make them sustainable is absolutely key. The other thing is private sector works differently than the humanitarian sector, and it takes some concerted effort to understand each other's objectives, ways of working, financial models, legal frameworks, and you really have to invest time and effort to get it right. And it often takes, in our case, my engagement and my commitment to the private sector partnerships has been critical to address and sort of break down some of our traditional ways of working, because I think the first answer often in whatever sector you're in, but certainly humanitarian sector, is like, no, that's not the way we do it. They must do it the way we do it because we do it the right way. Right. So you really have to be prepared to break down your traditional ways of working and problem solve until you get it right. So the pitfall I think that we often see is it sounds really fun, it seems really sexy, so you agree we're going to do something, but then there's not the staying power to make sure it's actually delivering for people in need.
Yeah, and then did you get around the language barrier? Because I've always found that that has been like the most catastrophic attempt to try and bring the two communities together, like not understanding what the other one was really talking about.
I have a funny story. So, my husband works at the forum now, the World Economic Forum, and he came home so excited and he said, "Do you know what a bilat is?" And I was like, "Yeah, we have them all the time." He's like, "Yeah, I have my first bilat." He was so excited about this bilateral meeting. A bilateral is just a meeting between two partners. He was so excited to learn the lingo and to say that he'd actually had this meeting. And he'd spent his whole life in the private sector, right? So, like, and then you get into the acronyms of the UN, and it is learning a foreign language.
Yeah, no, not just in the UN. I just want to make sure we bring in the audience, but a couple of questions more, perhaps more personally. I mean, you've taken up the role of Director General at the moment where, as I was saying before, it's both the scale of displacement, but also the scrutiny of
Mhm.
the institutions, that are higher than ever. How do you balance the different aspects of this role, between the diplomacy, the delivery, the outcomes, what you're trying to do in terms of changing the way the organization works?
So it helps to have a vision. I mean, I have a strong view, and it's informed by, I started my career as a prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, prosecuting human trafficking cases. And I saw from that position as a baby lawyer what was going wrong in the system more broadly, and including the fact that we were hyper focused on cases of trafficking, but actually there are a whole range of people who are exploited, and exploited because they are vulnerable, exploited because they don't know how to use a system, because they're coming into a system without the language or knowledge or understanding of how it works. And so from the kind of beginning of my career, I have identified where I think we need to go in this space around human mobility, addressing displacement. And I I ran for the job with a vision of what it was we needed to do. And so bringing the organization along with me, having us articulate the three objectives that we are going to accomplish, um, engaging at every level, all the way down to seed that idea, funding what works, recognizing we have to let some things go if they don't work. That has motivated me, and I believe that we are trying to do something that will fundamentally change the way we think about human movement and will empower people in ways that will have enormous developmental dividends, but at lower costs and resulting in more impact for more partners. So that is motivating, right? For me, even if we end up with half of our funding, the funding we do have, we need to move forward to enable those better outcomes.
Yeah. And we completely share the view that more money is not necessarily better impact or better results. You need to be focused on what can really be transformative. And I think the vision that I know we share is to actually seeing society recognize that displaced people are
people,
entrepreneurs, they're leaders, they are, sort of the part of society as workers. So my last question would be, what gives you hope that we can really shift the narrative around, displacement migration from one of crisis to one of contribution?
Because it's about people, because and it's not, I want to honor and recognize the lives that are lost of migrants and displaced people and not make light of that. But sometimes we overly focus on the sad stories and the death and the vulnerability, and we don't fully appreciate and recognize the powerful contributions, ideas, tangible outcomes of many of the people that we serve. And so that's what keeps me going, and that's what gives me hope, is because we're talking about people. We're not talking about sad sacks who just need help. We're talking about people who are, if you give them opportunities and enable their skills and their talents and their contributions, they could be the ones who are solving the climate crisis. They could be the ones who are coming up with new ways of getting education to those who are otherwise uneducated, right? Like and we see it every single day in our work all around the world. And frankly, that is fantastic. And by the way, that's why you should want to work on the issue of migration. I mean, I know working for children or working on food issues are really immediately accessible and, and they're worthy causes. But the beauty of working on migration is that you're actually tapping into human capacity and you're thinking about how we unleash that talent and opportunity to make the world better for more people, including ourselves. So I love the issue. I mean, as hard as it is, and it's hard, but there's actually something that is multi-dimensional to what we're trying to do that I think will lead to better outcomes around the world.
And of course, the history of the world is a history of human mobility,
That's
right?
right.
I mean, starting from the person speaking to you, I was a migrant to this country, 30 years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
That's how I got here, came here to study state. But of course, I had a more powerful passport than most people that, try to cross borders today. And that is, unfortunately, where the conversation gets stuck. But we also know from all the work that at ODI Global and many others have done, that there is nothing that contributes to the development of a country more than what migrants put back into those countries through remittances. That is the most transformative thing that you can do. So let's keep trying to shift the narrative. But with that, let me open the conversation. There are plenty of people in the room. There are roving mics somewhere. I'll take a few questions at a time. Introduce yourself. I'll start here to you.
Hello, my name is Karen Page-Bachadam. I'm from SOAS. I'd like to ask you a question about the role of IOM in Tunisia. I don't know if you can comment on that. I know it's a difficult situation, but there are, as you will know, there are people who are being rounded up on a regular basis and either detained or dumped at the border in the desert by Algeria or Libya. Now, if you ask people on the ground and you say, what are they doing? Like, what's UNHCR and IOM doing about it? And I'll say nothing. We don't hear from them. They're doing nothing. And that's the perception that IOM and UNHCR are doing nothing. So I know it's difficult. You say, well, why aren't they doing anything? And they'll say, well, they're scared. They're scared the government's going to chuck them out. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Let me take a few. Yes, I was coming to you here.
Thank you. So my name is Sandra. I'm a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. And I would love to hear your views about the impact of the demographic shifts that are occurring in advanced economies and the aging of societies, and whether you see this as an opportunity to change the governance of migration. So moving from managing migration flows to a political narrative that is much more about strategic population planning, and how would the IOM fit into these changes?
Yes.
Let me take Jessica and Orzal, and then we'll do one first.
Hi, I'm Jessica Hagedzanke, and I'm head of the Migration and Displacement Hub at ODI. You finished off with, I guess, your vision and how we need to change the narrative. And I'm sure that's a vision that many of us in this room share. But the stumbling block is more political than
Yeah.
I think the ideas. And so I was wondering how the political impediments can be overcome. Yeah,
Okay.
thanks.
And let me just get Ursula and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much. Really inspired by your remarks. I can clearly see how it makes a difference when a woman is on the lead. Ursula Nehmet from Afghanistan. And many of the things that you've said personally resonates with me. I was a war refugee in my earlier ages. So grown up in Pakistan, refugee communities, and started my career in development since then. But my question is mainly for a situation, an emergency situation evolving now in the border between Iran and Afghanistan. Iran is, in a very inhuman way, massively expelling and force deporting Afghans, and it's as high as until yesterday in one day 43,000 people are kicked out. That includes anyone, women, children, all. So first, my question is that the country that was is hostile and inhuman in their behavior. The country that is recipient of the refugees is also not any different, to be honest, in terms of their ruling regime. Although I hear that the Taliban are a little more collaborative than they are expected to be. But still, when it comes to women's issue, when it comes to accessibility, there is nothing. So my question is that how you navigate the sort of like response to the situation of refugees within this context, and is it a priority? What is the situation in terms of funding? Because we know things are really getting worse. If I'm allowed, I would like to also attach another question, which very much also linked to what you were mentioning about the role of the private sector. One significant observation we had in this immediate emergency is the role of the local communities, the young volunteers, girls coming together and trying to volunteer, although like covering and respecting the norms, but still going to sort of like welcome the refugees with their empty hands. They don't have much resources to offer, but at least to give them a moral support that you are not alone and this is your own country. But also the private sector in Afghanistan, although weak, hit by sanctions, hit by all kind of challenges, banking, blockages and everything, but they are offering services like transportation and others. So the question is that are there like spaces or opportunities to build up on these kind of authentic or local responses to make it part of the planning, as was mentioned? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so a couple of things. One is the funding restrictions are serious and they're real and they're having impact. So I want to acknowledge that. Our organization has been funded by the United States government at 46%. And much of that funding has disappeared with the change in administration. We're not the only ones. Our partners at UNHCR and World Food Program and UNICEF and everyone in the UN system, and then our partners within the INGO community have been hit hard, and some of them have fully disappeared. So that is real. And if I could just do a public service announcement, what worries me deeply about governments cutting foreign assistance, and including when they're shifting foreign assistance to defense systems, they're missing an opportunity to create more stability and safety and more localized, more effective, less expensive solutions to the issues of displacement. And even, one of the conversations I've had with many of our UK partners here is, I understand the politics of the small boats and the crossings of the channel, but the answer is not to cut foreign assistance and development assistance, because that is a way to provide more concrete solutions for people at better cost and in more humane ways, right? So, and I say that because when we talk about how we engage to support, whether in Tunisia or in Afghanistan, in Iran, it does take some amount of resources. And this is a question that just cannot be avoided. It doesn't mean that countries or communities should rely into perpetuity on foreign assistance, but there are legitimate needs. So maybe if I start with Tunisia and we'll go through. So Tunisia, it's actually not true that nothing's happening. I was just there about 4 weeks ago. I met with many migrants, including women who were victims of trafficking and sexual abuse at a center where we are working with local partners to provide support to them. It is difficult, and the space is shrinking, and particularly for our local partners there, many have found themselves arrested. Many of them have faced a lot of repression, and it has made many of them afraid to provide support. But IOM is still there, and we're still providing support, including in the displaced persons or migrant camps that exist, including for those who have particular needs, and including by helping people get home safely and with some measure of dignity. But this goes to the financing question, right? There are real needs here, and there's huge political pressure. When we saw the changes in Tunisia a couple years ago, we saw a huge influx of migrants come across the Mediterranean, right? So there is I won't say one-to-one, but there is a definite correlation between the political stability on the ground and the support for the response and onward migration. So it's not easy, but we work in lots of places that are just not easy. Another place we work like that is, of course, in Afghanistan, where we have communities who are working to support with locals, with partners, but also we have about 1,000 IOMers on the ground in Afghanistan who are providing support to the Afghans who are coming home, many coming home after decades in Pakistan or Iran, many with very little, many who had been traumatized, many who have lost their savings and their material goods, and then we're providing support to them. Now, it's interesting, though, because I do think that sometimes this is a mistake we make in the communities. We sometimes just see people in those circumstances in their situation of desperation and vulnerability. And we fail to recognize that many of the people who are coming home with better skills or better education or better capacity than they left. And so thinking through within our communities, how do we actually tap into that and enable them to use what they've learned, even if they're moving home into Afghanistan? So our intervention shouldn't just be about how do we provide their short-term humanitarian support. How do we figure out what skills or capacity they have and then think about unlocking it? I saw that in the case of Sudan because we work in Chad with returning nationals from Chad who'd gone to Sudan for work or education. And then when the war broke, they had to leave. And the humanitarian response was very focused on, okay, how do we get them shelter, hygiene kits, failing to recognize actually this community is a more educated, more experienced community than many in the local population. So how do we actually make them part of this solution? So there's possibility that I think we haven't fully leveraged in many of these responses. The demographic question is my favorite question. I would encourage you to read my foreign affairs article because I actually think the demographics of the moment are going to provide us the opportunity to rethink and recreate a system that works for more people. Because quite frankly, we do not have the young people coming up in many of the major economies around the world, not just in Europe, but especially in Europe. And we do not have a efficient distribution of people with jobs. And the way to do that could actually, the more we can connect people to job opportunities wherever they might exist in the world, the more we can enable more sustainable development assistance. So I actually think, even though right now there's so much anti-migration rhetoric, I predict in 10 years, people will be competing for migrant talent because they'll just need it to keep their pensions funded and their economies moving. And so this will be the moment we need to be prepared to seize as it comes, because I see it on the horizon. And then that's how we're going to deal with politics around this issue is, I said to somebody earlier today, my goal is to make migration boring again. Um, right? The political rhetoric is actually harming the ability of governments to act strategically. And there is a real tension between what a government needs to move its economy forward, to innovate, to create more jobs and opportunities for people, and current migration policies. And so I believe very strongly that we need to build alliances between some non-traditional actors. We need to shed our traditional notions about who's good and bad, about whether your political label determines whether you're a appropriate actor or partner in the space. And we need to build alliances between the private sector, the faith community, between small town mayors, between the diaspora, between governments, and come up with something that actually will work for more people. And if we don't do it, it doesn't mean that people won't move. People will move. It's just that we'll see chaos. And so if we have a moment. Are we out of time?
Well,
Yeah.
I was hoping we could carry on for one other.
Stop.
You have a hard stop. I have a lot of questions online.
Let me do one more, and then we're gonna go see the Home Secretary. So.
Okay, right. Yeah, that is important. Maybe I'll just take one online to give justice to the online audience, and then it looks like the Home Secretary is waiting, so we probably need to stop. Iris Kreber is asking, Amy, many thanks for inspiring comments. You've explained the politicization of the small boats narrative and how politics are driving a zero-sum game narrative of either development aid or defense and security, which use it out is a false economy. However, how do we change this simplistic black and white narrative, which is critically driven by populist agendas scaring incumbent governments, unless they are already in government?
So I don't have the silver bullet. I don't think there is a silver bullet. I do believe in the power of human storytelling. Much of the anti-migrant rhetoric is being fueled by a form of storytelling, right? Migrants and crime, migrants and terrorism, migrants and blah, 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 blah. But actually, there are so many more stories about migrants driving change, driving impact. And, I've told this story before, but it's worth saying again. I have family members who voted for Trump, who would traditionally have been anti-migrant, anti-refugee. I've invited, I had one instance where I invited a Kurdish refugee over for dinner, invited the family member. And by the end, my family members were like, we need more of these refugees. Why aren't we getting more in? And it's like this humanizing of the story, the finding the common ground, the having, the care worker who's caring for your mom or dad, right? It's powerful, these stories. And so humanizing, and then not, we in the UN, we in the aid community, in the humanitarian community, we tend to speak in this stilted language that nobody else understands. And we tend to have huge arguments over the words we use. We've got to tell the stories. Just say what it is we do and the people we support and the good they do when they have the means to do it.
Amy, thank you so much. I wish we could go on a bit longer. I don't want to be killed by your team.
We blame Macron.
We blame Macron. We agree on that. I think we all agree that we need to contribute to change the narrative to make migration boring again.
Yes,
I like that. Let's definitely commit on that. We'll have you back in the new office. So let me take this opportunity to say that if you're coming back to an ODI event, don't come here because we're moving next week. We're moving to 4 Millbank. So next time you come to an ODI event, will be a 4 Millbank just opposite the Houses of Parliament. But we first of all say how wonderful it has been to have you here, even briefly. Start the conversation. We'll carry on, I'm sure, and try to continue to work on these issues together with you and your team. And please join me in thanking Amy Pope very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.